course editor of Herbert. I'm from Victoria University of Wellington and kind of a bioprotection Aotearoa. And contrary to what I obviously submitted in the abstract, this work is by no means done by me alone. We have a huge team, so I just want to acknowledge the help, as well as all the various Māori whenua whose rohi this work was conducted on. That's Ngāti Kahununu ki Wairarapa, Rangatahi i Wairarapa, Ngāti Toa, Te Aotearoa, and I can never say this one, but Poko. So I just want to say all those thank yous up front. Basically, our work is concerned with the question of where should we do species conservation. In my own opinion, it's ideally where our efforts can be efficient and the most likely to pay off, because we have such limited resources in conservation, sadly. And there's a lot of spatial variation to consider. Firstly, you want to be, putting species in the habitats that are actually suitable for it. Also, there's very spatially dependent processes in terms of risks and opportunities across the landscape that need to be taken into account. And also the human dimensions, where are people actually able to do conservation action, where do they want to do these actions? And traditionally, we tend to approach these kinds of problems using a mixture of species distribution modelling overlaid with risk maps, which it accounts for the first two of those things. But quite often what is really accounted for in these studies is the really critical role of people in conservation as, effectively support crews of species, just trying to get them through the scene. We work with swamp Māori or Māori Tawaki. I feel like we've already had a lot of introductions, so I'll try to keep it short. But basically, it's a double-headed threat kind of a situation. They've lost a huge amount of their range, so they're quite a wetland obligate tree. We've lost over about 90% of our wetlands across Aotearoa, so the species was probably a lot more widespread than it is now. And now it has this new threat of myrtle rust, which seems to be very, very susceptible to. And I really hope I'm wrong, but I think we could be facing a risk of functional extinction in the next sort of 10-ish years if we were to do nothing. So it's really heartening to see all of the amazing conservation work that is being done for the species. So what we wanted to do with our work was take a different approach to refuge identification. And I say different because this has been done before on a national scale by James McCarthy and his team. Where we're I think we were like, oh, it's kind of sad that we don't really have a lot of area that's predicted to be suitable for the species in Wellington. And it's one of those rare species conundrums, I think. It's quite often when you've got a species that's got a really fragmented range, when you apply data that's come from a systematic presence agent survey, it's so easy for species locations to get missed. So we wanted to address that if we could. The first thing that we did was we actually restricted our study area to the Greater Wellington region, and that was really fortuitous because it made it quite achievable to go out and survey for additional presence records, which my colleague did, which is really great. Secondly, the Greater Wellington Regional Council has got some very high resolution data available for hydrological modelling, and this is quite important with our very, very wetland obligate tree, because sometimes these little pockets of wet habitats can just be like a stream bank or just the bottom of a gully, areas that kind of span 5 by 5 meters. And typically that type of really fine scale resolution gets lost in species distribution modelling. So you've often got kind of larger spatial resolutions. And turns out our idea did pay off. So the National Vegetation Survey yielded records of 5 Māori Tawaki presences in our study region, and lots and lots of places where it was absent. But then we were able to add an extra 268 presence records to our data set. Now, these data are really, really hard to model because there are actually 2 different observation processes. You've effectively got a presence absence observation process, which is, for the nerds out there, it's a binomial process. And then you've got a presence only data, which is more of a count-based process. So actually 2 different probabilities of observation there. But we're actually really lucky. There's been some really recent advances in the field of integrated species distribution modelling that is designed exactly for these types of data sets that have been really, really hard to analyze in the past. So we did that. And then we were also able to construct a data-driven soil water logging filter for our model estimates, basically using a really neat and pretty innovative methodology to combine data across different spatial scales, because when you do SDM, the scale and resolution of your model really, really matters. So it's important to get those matching up. The solution that we had, we did integrate SDMs. We used Bayesian process models. These we fitted with integrated response approximation, which is just basically a really efficient way of fitting those models, whereas traditional Monte Carlo methods are quite computationally, they just take a long time on the computer, and when you do models on scale, they just really blow out your compute times. We got our biophysical inputs at a 100 by 100 metre resolution from the New Zealand Environmental Data Stack. So when you put all that together, you come up with that like this. First thing you'll probably notice is that it's actually quite difficult to interpret, because these models give you a predicted point intensity, whereas more traditional types of SDM will give you the probability of occurrence. So the way that we got around that is we just standardized all of these predicted point intensities around the mean, and we went, cool, all the areas in purple, they are predicted to have lower than the average point intensity, therefore we think they're probably lower quality habitat. It's not for my Tawaki. Whereas all the sites that had predicted point intensities that were higher than the mean, again, we standardized the mean to 0 just to make it easier. We think those are all higher habitat quality. So you can kind of see the purple areas, not so good, the teal to yellow areas, quite good. Now, then we had the additional challenge of just modeling soil water logging across the region. This is done with a Python plugin to ArcGIS, and it's really good because you can model soil water logging at a spatial resolution of 5 by 5 meters. So really that finds our resolution that we wanted to get. And get that like this, which doesn't always make that much sense, but that's fine because we've been able to use our presence data to effectively interrogate what do those different levels of flood risk classification actually mean for the tree. And basically we just compared the observed number of points with the interquartile range that we did by bootstrapping, because computers can do that, yay. And basically we were able to classify the areas that had the observed number of points. If it was higher than the interquartile range, those areas were deemed suitable, and the areas that had fewer observed points than expected were deemed to be unsuitable. And that means you can then create a soil logging photo, basically just aggregating those model predictions up to the scale of your SDM. Remember, that's 100 by 100 meters. And you come out with a filter that makes a lot more sense. So you can see basically the areas where you have a high concentration of suitable soils are all in really dark blue, and as you go lighter and lighter, you get fewer and fewer suitable soils. So we overlaid that on our predictions, and you come up with probably a much better idea of suitability across the region. I think the first thing to note is that everything in grey, those areas contain no suitable waterlogged soils, and generally they're just on really large on hill slopes. So we're just able to refine our model a lot better. And what we did identify is that in the region, we have 1,230 kilometres squared of suitably waterlogged sources, not mighty, but obviously of like varying biophysical suitability for the species. But I think the most important point is which areas are actually feasible for management, and what does this actually mean in terms of just trying to tackle this problem? To do this, we examined 5 scenarios. We looked at the areas that are actually going to be really easy to access, because we suspect that a lot of conservation action is going to need pretty intensive monitoring of myrtle rust, and possibly things like spraying or even applying microbiome inoculations. So we defined accessible as being within 500 metres of a road, because it's pretty easy to get to. Secondly, we developed two myrtle rust scenarios. The first of which had very low, basically like a very low probability of infection. That was based on what level of risk from the myrtle rust process model, or basically below what level of risk do we never see infections. So you can see it's a pretty tiny area on that day. Certainly Constructed a second more permissive scenario that allows about 25%, 25% of the injections are in these areas. And that considers a bigger area. And of course, combine this with areas that are both accessible and have very low middle rust risk, and areas that are both accessible and have low middle rust risk. And basically, we came up with this much land as manageable. Basically, like as you apply stricter and stricter goals over time, you should expect the amount of area that you is probably feasible for conservation goes down. These numbers for someone outside the region, I think, seem pretty esoteric. So what we did then is we tried to figure out how many locations of trees actually fall in each of these areas under the different scenarios. What was actually quite cool is we do think we've probably got at least 712 swamp lighting in the area. Give or take, these are locations that have got at least one tree there, but we don't really know how many trees there are at each. Under each of these scenarios, we basically constructed these cumulative abundance curves. And I think a key takeaway here is that if we can apply conservation either equally or suitably with log soils, we can protect, in terms of existing locations, we can protect pretty close to the mountain pole region. But that drops and drops and drops as we sort of worked on that later on, like once we can only protect trees and sites that have got low infection risks or very low infection risks or only those accessible sites. Unfortunately, there's only 9 locations that are actually in areas that have low infection risk and are accessible, and no existing locations in areas that have very low infection risk and are accessible. So I really interpreted this as a call to action. We think that if we only protect those locations with existing trees in the lower risk and or accessible sites, I don't think it's going to maintain the current abundance of middle rust. Sorry, probably maintain the current abundance of middle rust, but it won't maintain the current abundance of muddy tawaki in the area if middle rust doesn't cause declines, which we think it will. Our solution for this is we think that it's not a give up. We think that there's a lot of things that we can be done, and we're just really smart about how we can use this information to prioritise our conservation effort. We think the highest priority is that 1 to 52 kilometres net of area that has both the lower infection risks and is really easy to get to. And we think the key actions are probably, monitor and manage middle rust as we can. But I think really importantly is actually going to actively plant more trees into these locations just to foster the abundance in these areas we can actually manage. But that's not quite it. We also think that it is possible that a lot of these areas that lie in sites that have got higher infection risk are actually really accessible, and we have a really engaged conservation community in the Wellington region. So it's possible, we think, maybe to try to monitor and manage across a large area. So what we do manage refuge here. Lastly, we don't really know how the infection is going to proceed. There's still a lot of uncertainty in how we monitor and how we model infection risks. So it is entirely possible that we do have more natural refuge here, and that's between 20 to 134 kilometres squared in the region, which is actually quite optimistic. So it's possible that these trees might survive. And I think really to end, I think the key thing is that Māori Tawaki is probably going to be a really hard species to save, but I think with the really good tools that we've seen in this room and spatial prioritisation and really committed people, I think we've actually got a fighting chance. So hopefully we've got it. And I just want to say thank you for hosting us and for listening. And our paper should be coming out in the next couple of days as then we open access so you can find it.